I'm back with another episode of Semi-Pro. My guest for this episode is Joe Cardali, Tolkienfanatic. He's here, the co-owner of Dust2 US, a longtime editor over at HLTV as well as Liquipedia, and a content creator in the CSGO space, just more broadly speaking. From my point of view, you're coming in here essentially as a lifer in the CS space. And like I said a little bit before we got started, I've just seen your name all over the place. I wanted to ask you a few words, if you could describe why CS and why competitive gaming, more broadly speaking, is so important to you that you would be essentially on the path that you're on now, where you decided to go and do all the editing on Liquipedia and on HLTV and essentially get to the position you're at now. Can you talk us through essentially the process?
Yeah, it's kind of like a multi-part thing, right? So why CS? Was a huge 1.6 fan back in the day. Wasn't so much into the competitive scene, because I was obviously a little bit younger and not as much aware of everything going on. But like from a game perspective, I played many more hours of 1.6 than I have of Go, right? We're talking about hours that aren't even tracked anywhere because Steam didn't even log your hours back then. If you fucking dig up my Xfire profile from 15 years ago, there'd probably be a few thousand hours on there. So YCS it's like, to me, it's like, it's almost the perfect like synthesis of what a competitive game should be. Like I think that really like fighting games like Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat are like really the purest form of competitive like video games. It's like clearly like one on one. You can look at a screen and just like intrinsically know what's going on, even if you like have no context. And to me, CS is almost the same way. Like, yes, there are tons of layers to it, but you can put someone in front of a CS match and kind of they just like intrinsically will know what's happening and like understand the high level kind of meta of everything. Um, so to me, like it's always been very interesting, like how it's very easy to get, but then super super deep. And then I guess how did I get involved in kind of the Wikipedia and HLTV and all that? And like it very simply is that like uh, I'm the kind of person that like when I see something that's like broken, I have a desire to like fix it. And sometimes you can go about that by like trying to ask the people who are in charge to fix it. But oftentimes I find that those people move too slow. So, I kind of just, tried to pick up a shovel myself and kind of never really stopped. So here we are, 7 or so years later.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that. I was actually going to save this question a little bit later after we had talked a bit more about essentially your interests and what you've done in the space. But since you bring up the fact that you have that desire to sort of fix any problem that you see or fill any hole that patch anything up that you can, especially given your history with or your experience being that some people are just too slow if you just report it and move on. I'm curious as to how that ties into your software engineering background, because from your Twitter bio, which of course is the first place anybody would look for prep for an interview like this, I was seeing that you actually have it set there that you're a software engineer. And so do you think there's a connection to be made there? Do you think that maybe there's some overlap between essentially the lessons that you learned as a software engineer working with that sort of thing and what you see on websites, how you edit those and try to make corrections where possible?
Yeah, no, it definitely there definitely is a connection. It's definitely like a psychological mindset or even mantra that, I have that I take with me, in my daily job. As a software engineer, that translates over kind of to the esports space and vice versa, which is that, um, you should leave things better than how they were when you found them. You know what I mean? Like kind of like that old Boy Scout slogan. Essentially, is that you always leave the campsite cleaner than it was when you got there, right? And to me, uh, that just like is something that applies to like very broadly to life, right? Because if everyone just keeps on kicking the can and saying like, oh, this thing is screwed up, this thing is screwed up, like yes, like 99 out of 100 people will be able to identify that something is screwed up, right? But the people that are actually making the change and driving things forward are the probably like the less than five people that are actually going to stop and do something about it, right? And then that allows people to then move on to the next thing that is obviously screwed up, and then someone else will fix that, and so on and so forth, right? Otherwise, you just kind of get into like the situation where you're surrounded by these broken windows and you're just paralyzed by like which one do I fix first? If you fix them as you go along, it's much more manageable.
Right. In my own space, I find something similar has happened with some code bases that I've seen for video games in particular, where especially, I mean, this is a tweet that came out from one of the ex-Valve devs who said that there was just mountains of spaghetti code that nobody really could circumnavigate. And if somebody wanted to do anything related to rendering, it was just going to be a month-long stress test of their own ability to handle and
Right.
manage all of these different things. Sort of like what you're saying is there's so many different angles that you could possibly take to potentially fix the problem that, or so many problems to fix in the first place that it's just impossible to get started. So it's funny how, like you said, that it's true in multiple facets of life. I was actually curious if we could tie this into the content that you've seen in the space over your tenure with esports in general, but also specifically with CS, if you like. I was curious as to what you think the biggest changes have been in content creation, and essentially, there's a lot that's different now than compared to where we were back in the days of 1.6. Obviously, you've got way better ways to connect with people. You can actually just reach out on Twitter or some of these other platforms and say, do you want to come on my interview show? Do you want to do this? Do you want to make this kind of content with me? So making collaborations and reaching out to people is much easier in theory. There's more access to information, but have you seen that manifest in an actual tangible change in the way that people consume content, the way that people create content? How would you describe essentially content creation as a hobby or as a field, a medium, down the years compared to where you started?
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly not an expert on this space by any means. I certainly have made observations over the years, and I don't think there's anything that is like necessarily unique about content creation and content consumption in the esports space. I think that I would posit what you would find if someone did a longitudinal study was that as kind of the ease of creating content has gone up, the desire and appetite for actual deep and long form content has decreased, right? And that's why, we've seen like we're in the age of TikTok and Snapchat and stories and fleets and whatever the case may be, right? There's really whether it's an actual desire or it's just something that is being exploited by these technology companies within people for like this quick dopamine release of content. Um, there's much more desire for stuff like that, right? And like, you know, I don't want to go too deep down this road, but that's where also you see like the rise of like your Keemstars and like other, like people like that who like truthfully are providing absolutely no substance and no value to anyone. Um, but they like to their credit, they nail that formula of just like that dopamine hit of like this stupid 10-second thing that is just going to get a ton of engagement, and like eventually you just become too big to fail. And the like kind of just keeps on rolling like that. I don't know if that answers your question, but
Yeah, it's more or less. It's one of the
yeah,
cases where you're more so isolating a change in the consumers, the people who are going to come in and take in that content, and as a result of that demand changing, like you say, who knows what the actual cause is, but in terms of that demand actually happening, we've seen differences there. Just as a personal anecdote, one of the things where uh, I I realized that this was happening pretty early on with the particular tweet. I sent out some tweet about the bot major when Richard Lewis was hosting that not so long ago. And it was just some, screen cap of a Reddit post that somebody else had made, and they were confusing the bots for actual players. And the joke was that Richard Lewis himself had said somebody somewhere is going to do that, and I just said, "Oh, it's happening." And the fact that I had done that, just like that 5 second thing that took no time to create, that's probably like the poppest off tweet I've had, right? So like that's a case where there's, if you weren't already familiar with this sort of process, you'd be like, what the hell? This I took 5 seconds to screen cap somebody else's comment and like sort of caption it, and that did better in theory than any of the long form content that I spent hours on or whatever. So like if you were actually, if you didn't recognize it would be easy to go crazy in a space like that if you didn't realize that it was just a trend and it wasn't anything personal. So have you had experiences with sort of this stuff before? Because I know you've actually done video content, not unlike what we're doing right now on your own channel. In the past, you had one with Drowlun where it was a Joe and Drowlun talk or something like that. So there was a
yeah.
couple of different series you had. There's an episode with Thorin if people are interested in going all the way back there and checking it out. So like, do you have any thoughts on essentially why we see in some cases? I mean, I've seen more long form content come out more recently, but in general, it seems like there was a bit of a dip a couple of years back, and we didn't see too much until more recently. Do you have anything to say about that more specifically in the space?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think if you're gonna do long form content, whether that is in text or in video, like you really need to be at another level within the space, right? Like Thorin can make long form content, Richard Lewis can make long form content, HLTV can do the occasional long form content piece because everyone reads HLTV, right? But if you are like someone trying to break into the space and really don't have like a semi significant following, doing long form content is almost like a no winning game, right? Like uh you know, you're just ultimately going to put so much more time and effort into it than ultimately you're going to see back in the ROI, which let's not even talk like get into the actual like YouTube revenue or anything like that, but just in terms of like just engagement, right? Because that is like ultimately what is the currency of the internet and all these social platforms. So I mean, I I think I think it's great to like supplement with long form content. But if that's like your raison d'etre and like that's the only thing you want to do, I think it's like a very hard proposition to kind of go from nowhere to like being like this long form savant essentially.
Well, there's been a case of if we actually look to Dust 2 US, which is the website that you're currently, you're an editor on in essence, and you're also, it seems like a lot of the people who currently write there wrote there because they went through you in a way. Like I had a note on earlier, and he mentioned that a lot of the stuff that he did to start off with, you were able to oversee. Um, I would say that it's not necessarily long form in the same sense that maybe we would think those long form HLTV paces are, but maybe a niche or specific to a specific category. That might be a better term for it. If I had to describe Dust2.us, I would say it's almost like a haven for those who are very, perhaps disproportionately interested in that NACS region in
Yep.
general. So, do you think that's an accurate description? Do you think like there's some information there that you can use to trace back why the site was created in the first place? Was it simply just to have a US focused facing for the Dutch webs, the DK version of it, or do you think that there's more to it than that?
I mean the vision for Dust 2 US, which was something that, you know, I had even before kind of HLTV had spun off Dust2.2K, which, you know, makes sense because HLTV is obviously, you know, two out of three of the owners are Danish. So you know, Denmark is near and dear to their hearts. Um, you know, the vision for Dust2.us was if HLTV, you know, you can view HLTV as like a very wide but shallow pool of Counter Strike, right? Like HLTV covers CS across the world, but like only really the top 50 or 100 or so teams like ever really get any notice from like a content perspective. Like forget about matches because that's a separate sort of a thing. So the idea for the Dust 2 sites, whether that be DK or US, or you know, you can apply that to any other region, right, is to be more like a very deep but thin sort of like a pool, right, that you can kind of dive into and go very deeply, and you can, and that's where you can find like people rising up through the ranks from like ESEA Open all the way to MDL, right, and that was really the vision, was to be able to like chronicle the paths of those players and teams as they kind of pay their dues and come up through the ranks.
So, given that it's essentially focused on providing some sort of exposition, some sort of platform for that level of CS in that region specifically, do you have any particular thoughts on how successful it's been in the almost 3 years that it's been running now? Do you think that you guys have essentially done what you've set out to do, and it's just about keeping it going now?
I mean, I think from like a mission standpoint and a vision standpoint, I am, you know, if the site were to, you know, be shuttered tomorrow and disappear, I think I would hold my head proudly and say that you know, I and we stuck to our guns and did kind of what we set out to do. In terms of like actual adoption and impact on the scene, I would say that it has, you know, primarily been a little bit disappointing, to be honest. You know, these past 3 years, kind of mostly in the lack of those things happening, right? You know, we really uh, had hoped to really step into the vacuum that was left by ESEA News, like shutting down however many years ago that was, or Godfrag or anything like that, and really was hoping that there would be more kind of rallying around the site, like by players and stuff like that. And that truthfully has not really happened, which has been disappointing. And yeah, I have no problem being honest about that.
Sure. One of the things that I think maybe we can draw a connection to is an observation you had made earlier about the kinds of content being different from what people used to be interested in. And it seems like that sort of culture change might be affecting Dust 2 in this particular case, the website, given that obviously some of the players that are on the come up are incredibly young and didn't live through the Gotfrag days. They didn't never played 1.6. Maybe they don't even they might not even be able to tell you what it looks like, right? So a lot of those people are just of a different generation, and as a result of that, they aren't necessarily able to relate to the same interest that those the players from the 1.6 days and from the source days had. So do you have
Mhm.
any ideas on how those players might be able to, and maybe not necessarily directly with Dust 2, but just in general, how the players might be able to forge a place for their own destiny in a way where they can actually help to create a platform that is sustainable for them? Because that's one thing that we've seen a lot is orgs dropping players and all of that, all of the news about that sort of thing. So just in general, do you have some thoughts on how especially NA specific players might be able to leverage the fact that they have access to a wider audience, given that there's a lot of people who are English speaking in the space? Or do you have any thoughts on something like that?
Yeah, I mean, and like this isn't even really tied to Dust2.us that much, but like, really, if you're a player and you have any sort of promise, any sort of potential, any sort of path to making it to, let's even say tier two, right? Certainly tier two in Europe, less so in North America, but um, if you're consistently playing in matches that are on HLTV that are being bet, you have no excuse not to be cultivating and managing your own brand, whatever it is that may be, right? But you just have to be doing it, and you have to be cultivating that through at least one social media outlet, whether that be Twitter or Twitch or YouTube or whatever the case may be. Ideally, you'd be like, firing on all cylinders and doing all of them, right? Um, but that is like where your true value is as a player, especially if you're not a, you know, no doubts about it, like star player, right? If you're one of these more fringe players that is constantly finding their ways in and out of teams, like your value is not just what you can do in the server, but also what you can do for an organization outside of the server. So essentially it comes down to like, don't be a clown on social. If you're going to be on social media, don't be a clown on social media, but ideally use social media to, further yourself and your personal interest, which, because you take those followings with you when you change organizations, right? So it's a give and take of, especially if you're a younger player, usually the organization will have more of a following than you. They will in turn transfer some followers to you kind of by picking you up, like, oh, here's this player. People will follow you. Hopefully you do good things for that organization while you're there. Eventually you'll find your way out of there, whether for good reasons or bad reasons, but you take those followers with you, right? And you know, yeah, that's basically it.
One of the things about organizations and what they might be looking for as well really taps into the idea of a player with a following. And especially, like you're saying, if you're not going to be a simple or Ziwu where you're just going to be banging heads and instantly get up to a top team in that sense, assuming you don't have the potential, or maybe it just hasn't been realized yet, but for whatever reason, you're not a star fragger. It's interesting to me to conceptualize players who say that they just want to play and they want to avoid streaming obligations or media obligations, which I have heard from those mid-tier players as well. And maybe that they use that. Maybe that's just fashioned as an excuse. I'm not really sure. But one of the ideas that I've constantly thought of is like that as actually an old school 1.6 mentality in a way where you just care about the game and everything else is almost bullshit to an extent. So the idea of players who are so far removed from that still sort of saying the same things. Do you think that the scene has just changed irrevocably and you can't go back to the days of where everything is gameplay focused and there's no room for media? Do you think players essentially have to adapt to that sort of new world?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the media landscape of like the big four US sports, right? So you got NFL, NBA, NHL, and MLB. And this will come as no surprise to anyone that follows me on Twitter. I'm obviously a huge baseball fan. Shout out to my Yankees. But the sport that is lagging behind and really losing the younger demographic is baseball, right? Because they have like a lot of the players and the work ethic and the spirit of baseball is very much of the team, not the individual. And yes, all that matters is what happens between the lines. Don't bother me about anything else. Don't ask me to talk about anything else. And while I think there is, to extent, a great amount of honor and humility involved in that approach, that's just not what sells, right? I mean, there's a reason that the NBA is a force, not just in the U.S. but globally, right? Because the players have personalities and the players are controversial and they do this and they dress and do ridiculous shit. So it's like that kind of that managed chaos of a personality that is important, right? And like also like just to be clear, right? Like when Mike Trout, who is the best baseball player in the world, says that like I don't want to do any media, I only want to play the game, that's fine because he's Mike Trout and he's making $500 million over the next 10 years. Uh, in esports, no one is anywhere near doing that right now. So hitching your horse to the content train is the way to provide for yourself, much further down the road than your competitive career will likely take you.
Yeah, I mean, even if we drew comparisons to Ziwu and Simple like I did before, which are essentially, if you had to think of like the star fragger as idols, it would be people like that. I mean, even I don't know if Ziwu still streams, but Simple obviously streams. They've both got
Yep.
YouTube channels. You can go check out their content over there, and fans are really interested in that precisely because they are these superstar of superstar players. So of course they've got a certain name value to them, but the fact that they're putting in the effort and hiring an editor for their movies or any of that sort of thing, it just goes to show you that there's even the best in the field who are the best at the star fragger dream of in terms of roles. Even those people have done their due diligence when it comes to actually putting out content. So it's almost like a self-defeating argument, I guess, if you're trying to argue at that from a player's perspective of like, hey, maybe I shouldn't have to do media because I'm the star player. And meanwhile, Simple's over here doing like interviews and post matches all the time and stuff like that.
Well, it is a bit of a chicken and the egg problem, right? Because like is Simple's stream successful because he's a good streamer or because he is simple? I would posit is probably the latter, right?
True.
The numbers that Simple is going to pull from streaming are different than like let's just say John G, right? Like John G, shout out to my boy. He could literally stream for 24 hours, for 5 months in a row, right? He will most likely not get the numbers that Simple is gonna get just by like, rolling out of bed one day, tweeting and saying like FPL, come watch, lol. And that's because he's Simple, right? So it is a bit of like a pyramid effect of, uh, you know, the more of a zeitgeist around you as a player, like the more successful all these tangential things will be able to be. Um, However, uh, you know, all money and press are good money and press. So, you know, get on that.
It seems to me as well that a lot of the things, especially if we take a look at the NA orgs that have recently been either rumored to or have confirmed to be dropping their rosters and exiting the game for Counter Strike, New England Whalers and Chaos are among them, and they were essentially the up and comers in the NA scene, along with Triumph and a few others. So it's almost like, in a way, it feels just like kicking the NA scene when they're down might be an apt description. We've obviously suffered a lot of losses to Valorant. We've suffered a lot of losses just because of the pandemic, and people are going to look to specific root causes. But especially when it comes to these orgs, if they're going to say that they're not making a profit necessarily, one way that you could leverage that as a player, maybe one could argue maybe it's not supposed to be within your purview as an employee, as a player. But in this case, if the alternative is not having an org, it seems like you might want to pick that anyway and pick up that slack. But as a player, in theory, you could impact that by having content, by having a platform, by having some social media presence, and by getting eyes on sponsors and getting eyes on brands, and then that increases the sponsorship deals in theory. So while I'm not personally an expert on the financials, maybe you have some ideas for essentially advice to players in terms of making them more palatable, more making those orgs essentially salivate over having them on the team and keeping the rosters for longer, because sustainability within the scene is a commonplace complaint from these organizations that end up exiting.
Yeah, uh, I think it's a tough issue to approach no matter what angle you take it from. And it's, you know, it's not complicated by this fact, but it is, I like the thing you can't escape from is that the ecosystem that we're in right now is that even the most successful organizations, um, your Liquids, your Cloud9s, your TSMs, whoever the case may be, they are venture capital backed operations. They are no different than any tech startup in Silicon Valley who goes and does a Series A or a Series whatever the hell, um, and they are taking on good debt essentially from venture capitalists who are pouring millions of dollars into the business, who are essentially disregarding the balance sheet and willing to do that for, depending on the time horizon, 1 year, maybe a couple of years, maybe even 10 years, right? Because to a lot of these mega corporations that have gotten into the space in the past 2 or 3 years, $50 million, literally blink of an eye, doesn't even matter. Like, that's like toilet paper money to them, essentially, right? Um, so the issue becomes like, how as an industry do we actually go from being like losses across the board to actually being profitable? And that will, like, whether there is an answer to that will dictate whether we are truly in a bubble right now or if we are not. uh, and I mean, the answer is probably going to be yes regardless, but I guess if we are able to solve that issue, it will dampen the negative effects of, when it bursts, really.
What would you have to say for NA's biggest issues right now in terms of sustainability, getting the orgs in, keeping the rosters active, and even the health of competition? Obviously, a lot of people have said that the quality of practice is not that high. Are there any essentially low hanging fruit things that the players or the orgs or the tournament organizers or essentially any player in the space, any entity in the space might be able to resolve? And even though it wouldn't require that much effort, just solving it would be one step closer to getting a healthier scene. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, we did Exner and I did a show a few weeks ago with Diego, who is, one of the founders of New England Whalers, and he actually brought up a very good point, which is that one of the reasons that Europe is able to have, or a lot of other scenes are able to have such a healthy tier two and tier three scene, is that they have so much more access to um, sponsorship money, right? Because the drinking age is younger, gambling is legalized almost across the board. So those are two like pretty big blockers to organizations in the U.S. Having access to just like solid sponsorship opportunities. So like really the ultimate answer may not have anything to do with the scene itself or the teams or the players or the organizations, but really just a matter of legislation. And like, do we have to hang on until there's enough states that have legalized gambling, right? Like obviously, I think we're up to maybe like 15 or so states that have legalized sports gambling. So I mean, that's a lot of progress from zero, or one essentially. Um, but I mean, from something in terms of that the organizations and players can do now, it's hard, right? Because the concessions they're not concessions that anyone wants to make, because the standard of living in the country is, at a certain point, and players feel their worth is a certain thing. So like players are not going to be happy when, if I tell them and sit here and tell them like, maybe just ask for less money and then you could get something which is better than zero. Maybe it's not what you want, but it's something, right? It's something to at least maybe avoid you needing to go out and get a job, a part-time job or whatever to supplement your CS playing. Um, so I mean, there's no really like silver bullet answer, and the answers will vary widely from player to player, just based on where they're located, right? Because like I believe Junior's from like Wichita, Kansas, right? So standard like cost of living there certainly not as high as New York, where Toy, who's like an older player that some people maybe are familiar with, but he's born and bred in Queens, like 5 miles away from where I am right now, right? So you know the the money that may make sense to one player may not make sense to another player, and vice versa.
Do you think that the salaries themselves being to some extent inflated? Obviously, before Valorant came around, that argument or that complaint had almost died away, and it was like the same sort of people like repeating it essentially over and over again. But at that point, they were almost shouting into the void because people had already heard it so many times, and they were like, "No, it's not a problem. It's fine now." Like must have died down. I can't hear anybody talking about it anymore. Meanwhile, the guys Thorin's just like, "Help! We don't have enough money to pay these players." Do you think that's actually still been a pretty big issue even into the current years? Because I mean, as a sort of economic idea in general, when there is ever a situation like a pandemic, like we're experiencing now, where there's not as many earning opportunities, any additional money that's going out the door that you're not going to see any return on at that point becomes that much more like essentially the magnitude by which it's a problem it increases exponentially. So, do you think that those sorts of issues that the organizations are now sort of dealing with, do you think that that was one of the sort of nails in a coffin? Maybe not the final one, but is certainly one of them.
Yeah, I mean, I do think to a degree, the situation that we are is like one that organization owners have like collectively made their bet in, right? I mean, there are organizations that have wildly overpaid to get into CS, right? And instead of there really being like a correction after that, it just has kind of seemed to be escalating, right? And again, it's fueled by this VC money speculation and influx of money into the scene, which allows these teams to do that. Cloud9 has committed like $6 or $7 million to their new roster over the next 3 or so years, which I mean, good for them. It's great to see investment into the scene like that. Um, is it justified? Time will tell, right? In that specific instance. But when you're talking about like players getting, $40,000 a month, does that like make economic sense? When we look at the actual raw financials, I would say probably almost certainly not. Um, so yeah.
I've heard numbers not quite that high, but still astonishingly high over in the Valorant space, especially given that it's so early. Do you have a feeling that something similar to what's happening in the CS space would not only happen to Valorant in a similar way, but even at an accelerated rate, given that we are in the current pandemic situation and that there's not nearly as many opportunities for venture capital necessarily? At least that's what it seems like for me. Do you think that a similar read might be happening over there?
I think it's probably even more likely to happen in the Valorant scene, especially if we look at and again, I'm not an expert on League of Legends, but from what I've seen from League of Legends, the numbers over there are just like cuckoo bananas, right? Um, because priced into those crazy numbers is the fact that Riot is putting a fuck ton of money into. Can we curse? Are we
Yeah,
allowed to
yeah,
do
no,
that?
that's fine.
Yeah. Okay. Riot is putting a ton of money into League of Legends, right? And the assumption is that, or actually, we have the announcement of Valorant Champions that came out today. It was always assumed that Riot was going to put a ton of steam and power behind Valorant as well, right? So um, that sort of like safety is what enables these organizations to feel safe to make these big money and like splash commitments into these games and into these players to do that. Um, which is again that like all feeds back into why you've seen all these big name organizations get into Valorant so early before there was any sort of infrastructure. It was, like uh at the beginning it was all like bedroom tournament organizers like putting on like, here's my $300 cup. All of a sudden, like 100 Thieves are just like, we're gonna assign a team to play in $100 cups. No, because of course there was the assumption that there was something much bigger coming down the pipe, right? And we've seen that First Strike is like the version 0 of that, and then the Valorant Champions like sort of thing going into 2021 is like at least like the next step of that, right? Um, so yeah, that's all a long-winded way of saying like the support that Riot and Blizzard give to their games is what enables these organizations to confidently put money and make these long-term and big money bets on players and teams.
Obviously, you've edited and written content, produced content on a lot of NA talent in general, especially at that sort of MDL tier that we were talking about earlier. Are you following their careers closely in Valorant? Is that one of the reasons why I've seen a couple of tweets from you on that subject? Any plans on maybe even getting into some sort of content creation in that space?
Yeah, I don't, I mean, there's certainly no plans for like me personally or the site to really get into Valorant content creation much beyond what we've done already, which is essentially when someone of note announces their transition to Valorant, we or gets picked up by a Valorant team, we'll kind of do that. And my perspective on that is that's kind of like closing their the chapter on their CS career,
Yes.
bid them adieu, and then they go on to Valorant. But yeah, on a personal level, certainly watching what is happening in Valorant very closely, and selfishly, as people have seen from my tweets, it does give me pride when I look at the all the players and teams that are having success in Valorant currently, and a large majority of them trace their lineage and heritage back to CS. So I'm certainly very happy about that. And unlike there's a lot of people who seem to have a lot of animus or wish ill will on the people that have kind of transitioned from CS:GO to Valorant. And again, it's an economic decision, right? Like, are you gonna toil forever in game A with very little prospect of making a career out of it, or uh, are you gonna take the talents that you've gotten from game A, bring them over to game B, and have the opportunity to make not only have a very nice career, but potentially make life changing money. I think that's like, if anyone could look at that honestly and critically, they would do the same.
Well, as a bit of a olive branch to the people who have a bit of animus or hostility to Valorant in general, I was curious because one of the things you said earlier was that 1.6 itself and some of the other earlier games, they just in general have this simplicity to them. I mean, CS:GO as well also has this simplicity to them, where you don't necessarily need all the context in the world, all the understanding in the world to understand what's going on. And from my limited experience, admittedly, with looking at some Valorant plays, I have no idea what's going on ever in that game. Do you have any ideas or any thoughts about the game itself and maybe some of the problems they might face in a long term battle with CS itself? I mean, maybe not publicly, but privately, it was intimated to be a CS killer in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just from the perspective of playing Valorant, I certainly feel like the gunplay in Valorant is not up to par with what someone would expect or be used to coming from CS. And I think that a complaint that a lot of people have made is that back before Valorant, it was only known as Project A. Kind of like the initial hype that Riot had put out was that. You know, Project A, or Valorant as it is now, was going to be a shooter with abilities, not a game with abilities that had guns in it. And I think that there is at least a certain amount of people who feel that they've missed the mark on that, and that it is a much more abilities-driven game than it is a gunplay and shooting mechanics driven game. And again, I certainly am not playing Valorant at a high level. I haven't even watched that much Valorant at a high level because I find it rather boring, to be honest. But so yeah, I mean, again, like watching Street Fighter, watching Mortal Kombat, watching CS, very simple. You have we have one dude was versus another dude, or you have five people versus another five. Everyone dies, great. And yes, that is like a permutation of how Valorant can play out, but obviously you have all these crazy abilities. And you get into the Dota and League of Legends problem where you're not in Valorant going to have a roster of 100 and plus characters that people are going to be playing, um, but even with the whatever 12 or 14 or however many agents there are right now, they each have 4 or 5 different abilities. There's all these different combinations and permutations of how to use those, and that's a lot of to ask from a casual observer to kind of get into parsing all of that. And I don't think Overwatch has done like a great job of proving that you can kind of crack that nut. I suppose Dota 2 and League of Legends more so. But if we're looking at like if we were to put them on a spectrum, right? I think we have CS:GO over here, we have Overwatch over here, and then Valorant is somewhere in the middle. So I would guess that Valorant will have more success than Overwatch, but I would be very surprised if it reaches the heights of CS. Which, and again, success is relative here because if you have Riot who's just dumping millions of dollars into it, like, does it have to be successful? Potentially not.
One of the things that I think we can talk about before moving on from the Valorant subject as well is, in a way, the game itself can trace its lineage back to CS, where it has Volcano, who's an ex-pro, obviously also a map designer in theory. We have a situation there where like that's a somebody who was a lifer within the CS space who moves on to work for Riot. Funnily enough, after the map that was put together, I think it was the bomb site map or something to that effect, where it was almost in infamy that he was responsible for that or helped in the creation process of it. So I'm curious on your thoughts, given that we have in some ways a pedigree for the game to almost expect it to at least have some Counter-Strike elements and try to take the best of that game and bring it on.
Hmm.
Given that we can also trace back a little bit of lineage, it's almost like also the fact that it came out after Overwatch should have prepared it in some ways, given it some understanding of how to market or at least present in a professional environment the matches that are going on and try to essentially put their best foot forward. In theory, they would have been able to learn from the mistakes made by Overwatch in the same way. So, given that, I think Overwatch is on the downturn in some ways because the game itself is not as fun to play as maybe it used to be earlier on before patches hit, but also just compared to other shooters. Do you think that we might have something like that happen again with Valorant, where the game itself isn't fun to play, or a game isn't as desirable to watch, or any of those sort of more fundamental issues before we even get into the pro play scene that you think might drive back not only interest on a casual level to Counter-Strike, but also some of the people who've in theory moved on from Counter-Strike to Valorant? Maybe some of them also will be coming back at a more semi-pro or pro level. Do you have any thoughts on essentially the trajectory of Valorant, both as an esport and as a game, but also the trajectory of its players and its audience?
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, I certainly would be curious to see if we were able to, you know, zoom back to February or March and, this pandemic never happens, right? And then Valorant drops. But CS is still going strong. We have lands, everything is honky dory. I would certainly be curious to see if we would see the volume of exodus from CS to Valorant as we are now, right? Um, because I think certainly we would see some people make the jump, but probably not as many, I would guess. Um, in terms of the trajectory of Valorant, I think like the thing about CS that can't be underscored enough is that CS was not made to be an esport, right? Because esports didn't like exist at the time that CS came out, right? So, CS was created and then the esport was built on top of it. Whereas now it's the other way around, where Overwatch was built to be an esport, Valorant was built to be an esport, and all this stuff. And like, there might be something to the fact that you can't just catch lightning in a bottle, like that, just, without trying. Like, yes, you can, ultimately you can make a giant flowchart of everything that makes CS what it is, right? But somewhere like outside of the lines, there's like something else in there that makes it special, and that's really hard to capture. Um, but I think that Valorant does have a good pedigree, and I certainly don't wish I don't wish ill on the players. I don't wish ill on the game, the developers, or anything like that. And ultimately, like competition is a good thing, right? So even you know, while I appreciate in some aspects the kind of hands-off approach that Valve has had, my hope is that kind of like this entrance of a viable competitor into the space will perhaps nudge them a little bit more to the hands-on in terms of supporting the scene and the circuit. Hopefully that would be the best outcome for like CS:GO.
Well, to your point about competition being good, I think one of the things that happened was once Valorant had launched, or a couple, maybe a month or so into its beta or something like that, the ability to copy and paste crosshairs from other players ended up getting added to CS as well, and that was apparently some feature that Valorant
Right.
had from very early on. So kind of funny there where we could see some parallels, especially since I'm not sure it's been the same in any other game where you have a game that comes out and while it doesn't it's not going to kill the other game, like Valorant's by all accounts not going to be a CS killer considering the game's trajectory currently, but it still siphons away professional players as well as the casual audience. That almost never happens. Like either everybody adopts to the new one or it just sort of it's a flash in the pan and then it goes away, right? So it's very rare to have this almost like symbiosis where we see for a longer period of time anyway both games in direct competition. So like you say, hopefully it spurs some change over in Valve's headquarters because honestly, just them looking at the game might be enough of a change to result in something. We haven't seen too much from them. So I am
I've
essentially to that point, and maybe you have some thoughts on how Valve might be able to improve. And again, low hanging fruit in theory, because it's so hard for them to do anything other than that. It seems. So, do you have any ideas about uh, down the years that you've been following CS? Any sort of thoughts on like paradoxically, CS is probably the best tack shooter, probably the shooter with the best gameplay of its kind. You know, there's like people will point out Quake and now Diabolical and stuff like that, which is a very
Mhm.
different kind of shooter, an arena shooter. But considering tack shooters, CS is probably top dog. Given that that's the case, and given that it's got such a promising aspect to it in terms of gameplay, in terms of following, it's like this endemic thing within the esports scene. It almost feels paradoxical that Valve hasn't given it the attention that it seems to have deserved or earned based on the amount of money that it's given them, the amount of interest that it's given them. Do you have any thoughts on Valve? Anything you want to say about them?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to comment on the whims of Valve, right? Because you can see that even within Valve, their approaches are completely different, right? The way that they run Dota 2 and treat Dota 2 is vastly different from how they treat CS:GO, right? And so is the issue there that Valve is famed for their flat structure, so people will just kind of do whatever they want to do, and there's not a lot of oversight. And I don't really buy that, right? Because like ultimately everyone's accountable to Gabe, and if you aren't making money, then like shit's gonna change. Um, so is it the like could it perhaps just be the case that like the CS:GO devs just feel that like the CS:GO cash cow is like just doing plenty well for them right now, and there's no sense in screwing with it? Potentially, maybe they felt that like with Dota 2, it like wasn't initially their product. Maybe they had to put a little more effort up front to kind of get that going. I can kind of see that going or kind of see that being the case. Um, Again, like I think there's like a lot of room for a middle of the road approach from Valve, where they historically with CS have been very very hands off. Like other than putting $1 million towards the major, which again is a drop in the bucket to Valve, right? Like they certainly could make that more compelling if they wanted to. Um, on that angle they're very hands off, but then you see when they do wade into the waters and they get very involved with the legislating of vac bans and throwing and kind of stuff like that, right? And obviously most famously with the iBuyPower guys with the throwing cases, but even with the vac bans with Yampi and some other notable players who were have been dealt vac bans at the age of 13 or 14 and now have, uh, no path forward to at least playing in the most notable events in the circuit, right? So like, it, and right there you have like the dichotomy of hands off versus hands on. And like in a lot of ways, neither of those approaches are working perfectly, right? So from what I've seen, like the Valorant dev team is very proactive with their outreach to like the professional players, which I believe there was outreach to CS players like at the beginning of CS:GO, and I believe at like some various points in between, but perhaps not on a consistent basis. I think that that kind of level of interaction would be very valuable to have, as well as like just like get a fucking community manager, like get someone who actually knows the space, who like knows like kind of what the people want, both the people that are competing at a very high level and like the plebs that are screaming on Reddit and Twitter, because even those people have valid thoughts from time to time, and like they're yeah, to your earlier point, like CS is making so much money for these guys, even when you ignore like the esports portion of it, that there's no reason why like all these tiny little nitpicky and paper cut things like can't be addressed, right? Like all the issues that people have with demos, the coaching bug, like obviously is like a completely separate thing, right? But like stuff like that, and to their credit, right, when something like disastrous like that does come up, like Valve generally do not let that opportunity like go by. Like generally there will be something that is done about that relatively quickly, because the last thing that they want is like this scene to like torpedo itself overnight, because like they kind of like just like to put CS:GO like in the corner and be like, yeah, you're mature, you're gonna do your own thing, I trust you. But like when it seems like that might get out of whack, they do step in, which is good. But again, I think more like some more proactive outreach from Valve would be preferable, from my perspective.
Well, certainly it would be nice to hear from them once in a while, at the very least. Like you say, the community manager idea is not a bad one. So I think one of the hardest parts of about any sort of question regarding Valve or uh, them in being involved in CS more or less than they currently are is that you have to shadow box the reasons in your own head as to why they might be doing it, because they certainly don't ever really tell you about it. So it's sort of the same thing as like when they made that really insane revolver change where they added that gun into the game and there was no real thoughts, or even when I think the op nerf came in, that was pretty controversial back in the day. Like they didn't necessarily explain why they did this. They don't usually explain why they make some sweeping map changes or why they don't make certain changes. Obviously, map pool has been a big issue of topic of note lately. So just the idea that a lot of the issues that people have in the community that could be resolved by Valve, we don't even really get explanation as to why they do or don't do certain things,
Hmm.
and as a result, it feels aimless wandering through the space trying to figure out what might be the solution to problems, because there's only so much the community can do. It's not like there's ever going to be an adaptation of like a pro mod, for example, that might because if you look at like some of the problems that people are having now, some people have complained about the economy, some people have complained about map pool, some people have complained about weapon balance in the past when the SG and the AUG were tearing people's heads off left and right. There's all sorts of situations where the community response as opposed to the developer response would have to be so globally adapted by everybody. All the tournament organizers would need to change their map pools that have nothing to do with what Valve has done. And then, of course, like there's the major angle where Valve is going to want you to do the major rules. And so you'd have to be playing by completely different things there. If you wanted to change the way that the game is played with some balancing things, you'd have to globally adapt like some server plugin for every TO. So, like, in a way, it feels like with a lot of the games that have lasted for a long time, they've done so because of their community. But in this case, we don't have the same ability that Valve does, the developer does, to have the community essentially do most of the work, which they seem to be willing to do anyway. So, do you have any thoughts on where we're not so limited, where the community might be able to step in and do some things that will help to improve CSGO from the current position that they are? Is it enough to just take certain ideas from other spaces like Valorant? Or do you have some ideas where maybe we've been blind to potential solutions to some of the problems that we have?
Well, it's like it's kind of interesting that you bring up like the map pool issue, right? Because the map pool is perhaps like the most obvious way in which you can see like that what Valve have actually done is actually kind of sneaky, because they are at the one hand very hands off. They kind of allow things to run as they are, but on the other hand, uh, we have these majors out here, and they run those with an iron fist, and they will say, this is what this major is going to be. Don't really care really what you have to say about that. This is how it's going to be, right? So, um, so if Valve comes out and says like this is going to be the map pool for the major, there's no real point to any other third party TO being like, oh, we're going to use these maps because we think they're better, because ultimately there still is like that sheen of allure to the major, even though like if you look at the way that the calendar and the money is spread throughout the calendar, like you have two majors a year of $2 million. There's so much more money on the calendar elsewhere, right? And this is why, like at this point in CS, the iBuy power bands and the VAC bands, like to a degree, matter a bit less, right? Because so many third-party tournament organizers have, basically said they've self-imposed their own like, oh, those things are expired, those things are defunct, whatever the case may be, right? But like for whatever reason there, and maybe it is just sticker money, like people want their sticker money, but there still is like this importance placed on the major, right? And that is like really the lever with which I guess Valve get to move around the pro scene. So in terms of like what those tournament organizers can do outside of the purview of Valve, there's really like, I mean, yes, theoretically they can do whatever they want. Like ESEA can say we're playing season in Tuscan next season, right? And EPL could do the same thing, right? But at that point they're going to catch hell from the teams, because they're going to say, why the hell are we playing, now we have to know 9 maps, instead of 7 for this major. So that like really is like, that is really like a blocker towards any sort of like community based improvements from like a economy or balancing or map level. And I frankly don't know how you get around that. uh,
Well,
yeah.
one of the things that just came to my mind when you mentioned stickers is, why haven't we seen? I mean, I'm sure there's an actual answer to this question, so in a way, it's almost glib. But why haven't we seen tournament organizers make their own skins at this point? Like, where's my Flashpoint AK in the game? I mean, to some extent, if that gets accepted, that could be revenue. Maybe you have uh, team stickers, not just for majors, but maybe like I've seen community stickers get accepted independent of majors. So I mean, obviously Valve still has to accept them, and maybe they would not do so if the creator was associated with a company or a tournament organizer or something like that. But maybe that could be a way in if Valve were to be so gracious as to say, yeah, sure, this can be added to the game. Not much for microtransactions by itself, but given that this is essentially what CS is known for a long time now with CS:GO, might be a way forward. I'm not sure if you've been privy to any. Obviously, it's a very niche thing. I'm not sure if you've been privy to any conversations that are similar to that, as far as like what some people at the TO space or even in the team space have wanted. Maybe you can also speak to a little bit to the impact of what you think that the stickers actually provide. Is it that really that much revenue? Do you think?
I can't speak to. I mean, it all depends on how the organizations and the contracts are with the players. Like, uh, and again, it will vary. Like going back to our like simple example from earlier, right? Like the amount of money that a simple is going to realize from sticker sales vastly, um, dwarfs anything that someone from a last chance qualifier team is going to get, unless that last chance qualifier team happens to be like a Cloud9 or someone like that, right? Um, but I believe that like it's been cited publicly, like those sticker sales on a player level can get up to like tens of thousands per major potentially, which is not necessarily life changing, but it's nothing to sneeze at. And if you're talking about two of those per year, and your team is consistently making them, then that's big money. And yeah, no, I mean, like talking about like tournament level stickers and skins and all that stuff, that would make all the sense in the world, right? And it would theoretically be very easy for Valve to do, because Valve just says, cool, Flashpoint, you submit these things, we take our 10-15% off the top, do whatever you like, as long as you're not drawing, dick skins or whatever the hell. Like we won't want that. But other than that,
Almost happened. We almost got it.
so close. Yeah, I mean that would be a great way to do it, and you can do it with skins, sprays, and kind of stickers and all that stuff. And yeah, it is curious that we haven't seen that yet. So that's a great point.
We might see it eventually. Who knows? One can hope. There's got to be something that we, the community, can do, or the players within it. So
You should put a patent on that idea before they steal it.
yeah,
Drop in
I'll make
tomorrow.
my own version of CS. Well, I always forget that guy's name, Nicola Nyholm style, where he was planning on doing that. The report said, I'll just and then the problem is I won't have a team, at least of all the best team in the world, to throw into that game, but I'll at least have the game, and then I can whatever. So what I
There's a
gotta.
lot of
Oh, go
sorry.
ahead.
I was gonna make a Valorant joke, but it's
Oh,
okay.
there you go. Yeah,
We-
they don't have a game either. Is that what you're gonna say? I see. I see. What you
no, I was gonna say. I mean, lots of people even for Valorant, and that's barely a game. But
Yeah, exactly. There it is. There it is. At the risk of sounding a little pedestrian, one of the things that I saw when I was doing a bit of prep is that on your Twitter you have a pinned tweet that's an image macro that says something to the effect of "Stop trying to make 6-man rosters a thing,"
yeah,
and I mean, obviously, like before, as far as I understand, the date on that is much earlier than Vitality started deploying their 6-man roster to seemingly some effect. So people are
yep.
going to give you an inadvertent amount of shit for that, I'm sure. But curious to know your context there. What is it, your take on 6-man rosters, and what was sort of the impetus of putting that out there, and especially of pinning it as well? It seems like you're standing by your words in that respect. What do you think about 6-man rosters?
Yeah, I, I mean, to Vitality's credit, they, I believe, are the first team in CS that I can think of that has actually said we're doing a 6-man roster and have actually implemented it and used it. Um, you know, the 6-man roster thing up to this point has been a meme for me, right? I think which started with Space Soldiers going with their tactical diversity meme, which was probably like four years ago at this point. But up until very recently, the 6-man roster was really just like code speak for uh, we're cutting someone, but we either don't know who yet or don't want to say who yet, and we're adding this other person. And it's like, okay, like and again, this comes from my like Wikipedia lineage, which is that every action has to have a counter action, right? So see, it's a 5-person game. You can't add a 6-person and not announce who's the person that's going to be making way for that 6-person is. Yeah, to Vitality's credit, I think that they've made it work. They've made it seemingly look viable. I'd be interested to see if they kind of keep up with it, or like I feel like eventually all roads lead to, if you have this 6th guy and he's just banging heads, like why don't you just make him the 5th guy, right? It's not the case that you have in football where you have a 53-man roster because you have to play offense and defense, and you have people getting injured on every play, so you need that like depth. There's like aside from like tendonitis and wrist injuries, there's like relatively little risk in being a CS player. Uh, so yeah, I mean, but again, shout out to Navera. Been doing big stuff, and another lineage guy. Obviously, little brother of Scream, who has got onto Valorant. So we're tying it all together here. Very good. I like
It was
that.
totally planned. Yeah, 100% intentional. One of the things I'm curious about from the perspective of that 6-man roster seemingly coming to fruition for Vitality and nobody else notably since then, or before then rather. I'm curious as to where you think this is going to lead us on a more, I guess, broad spectrum industry analysis kind of deal, because we spoke earlier about inflated salaries. Not only is it kind of unrealistic for most teams to even have the salary, on file for more than 5 players. It also seems unlikely that you'd even be able to have a ton of talent in your bench or waiting to sub out and sub in in the first place. So like those seem to have been the biggest counter arguments to it. But if it's going to start kicking off with vitality, do you think that this runs a risk of essentially inflating overall team budgets even further because people are going to be picking up more? Or have you seen really that much interest in general from people to tap into the 6-man roster now that Vitality's sort of like been a trailblazer in that respect? Or do you think it'll remain sort of isolated?
Yeah, I mean I haven't like really been looking into it that deeply, like to see which way the winds are blowing. I wouldn't be surprised to see if this very much goes the way that like the team sports psychologist or team chef or team trainer kind of fad has gone, which is that like seemingly every top organization has one of those personas in their organization now. Um, and I mean, I think that like certainly in the context of the team psychologist, that makes plenty of sense. But um, it's really hard to say. It can break either way. And again, like this is going to be something that you're only going to see the really tippy top organizations doing, right? Like I don't think you're going to be saying mid tier MDL teams being like, here's our 6-man roster. We're adding, this up and coming player. Probably not going to happen. Most of all, because those teams like aren't salaried. So why would that person ride the bench for no reason if they can be doing other things? Um, I don't know if it will inflate it. Like it will certainly inflate team salaries from like the macro level, like for the entire team. But I think actually from like an organization's perspective, it probably is a very cost effective way for them to get talent, right? Because they can say, all right, so and so, we're going to bring you on as our 6-man. Here is your like standing salary to like ride the bench and do whatever. You're still expected to know strats, be able to like come in and be, maximum effectiveness. And then like, for every map or whatever that we sub you in, you get like a prorated bonus for that or something, right? So it can be I can see it being a very effective way of being a better way to trial players, right? Instead of just like doing the okay, this guy's out and now we're gonna trial like 4 players and see what happens. You can do like the more gradual phase out of like, yeah, we know something's not right. There's this kid that has some promise. He's on this like shit team that's not paying him anything. We know that we can top that like with relative ease. So like if we can just do that, then we have him on our books and like worst case scenario, it doesn't work out with us, but we can probably turn a profit on him to some other team now, right? Um, so I think like this is where like the economics of everything like will start to that's almost more of like a soccer model, right? Where you're like loaning out players to other clubs to do stuff like that, and that's probably where this is going. But I don't know if it's gonna like really pick up uh, super soon.
Yeah, I think one of the notable loans we saw was when JKS was still in talks with Complexity and they needed a quick stand-in for Obo. NATO Safix came in, and I think he was on loan from Nordavind or whichever team he currently plays for. So that was a case where probably one of the only ones that I can personally remember of a loan happening at pro level CS, but certainly something that we might see more of. And obviously, that was due to exigent circumstances, not necessarily because of a 6-man sort of permutation. Curious as to if you have any sort of like lasting. We're towards the end of the interview now, so I was curious if you had any sort of lasting takeaways that you wanted the audience to sort of come away with, and maybe some final words or shout outs or any sort of thoughts you might have had regarding the topics we covered that maybe we didn't go too deep in.
I think I've probably talked more than I should have already, so I don't want to be too long-winded. But yeah, no, thanks for having me on. This is fun to do. Been getting back into the podcasting or whatever it is that we call this these days, a little bit more recently, so always fun to do. Um, yeah, if you're in North America or even just vaguely care about MDL or even advanced, sometimes even lower than that, check out dust2.us because we will keep on bringing you that content as long as we are able to. Um, and I guess on that same subject, shout outs to uh, the dust2.us crew. So all the writers past and present. So, note who you mentioned earlier, M&M's, Road to Dr. Waldo, who are the current squad right now. And then, all the alumni out there, you know who you are. Thank you for your service and for putting up with me. And that's really all I got. Yeah, if you have anything else for me, happy to. I have nowhere to go, so we can just keep going. But
Think
you
that'll do
probably
us
do.
though. Yeah. I mean, we covered a lot, and I really appreciate you taking some time to talk with me. So for sure, thanks for all of the work you've done down the years as well. Because otherwise, we might not be in the same spot writing wise. So appreciate it.
Can't take a lot of credit for that, but thank you. Nice to hear. Thanks for having me again.